1547, the year Henry VIII died in England, the Lithuanian beauty Barbara Radziwiłł and Polish king Sigismund Augustus got married in secret. When the secret came out, the world around them exploded. Jeff Prince is completing a novel that brings to life their love story and political frenzy it caused. I'm sure that every Polish person who is interested in history would enjoy reading that book. But it was written in English for an American audience. It introduces them to a phase of the Renaissance that many of them know little or nothing about, the golden age of Poland and Lithuania. While studying for his Ph.D. at the University of Virginia and then teaching English literature at Northwestern University in Chicago, Jeff read deeply in Renaissance literature and history. That was the cultural context for teaching Elizabethan and Jacobean drama and poetry. So of necessity, and later because of real interest, he learned a lot about the dynasties that governed Europe during that time. The Tudors in England, the Valois in France, and the Habsburgs in Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Spain. Years after he left teaching, Jeff visited Krakow for the first time and came face to face with portraits of the kings and queens of the Jagiellonian dynasty, who reigned in Poland, Lithuania, and vast Ruthenian provinces that Lithuania controlled. Jeff was shocked. He had never heard of the Jagiellonian dynasty, nor, he soon discovered, had the great majority of his fellow Americans. He decided to do what he could to correct that. Thus began the years of research, reading, inspecting the actual settings, and interviewing experts, which culminated in his book, In the Matter of the King's Marriage. Hello, Jeff, and welcome.
Hello, Basha. Thank you for taking an interest in my work.
Well, I wanted to ask you about your interest in the Polish Renaissance. I know that preparing to write this book took years, traveling and researching, reading, corresponding. What got you interested in that topic?
All of that wasn't originally preparation for writing a book. It was basically shock at my own ignorance. I'll tell you how it happened. I went to Krakow for the very first time, and when I was there, I naturally went to the Characterizing Museum, and I walked in there, and all of a sudden, I saw the famous, I now know famous, portraits of the last two generations of the Jagiellonian kings and queens. 10 miniatures framed together. At the left-hand side, there is King Sigismund I, and beside him, his wife Bona Sforza, in widow's weeds, because he had already died when the portraits were done. And beside them, the son Sigismund Augustus, and beside him, two of his three wives. Lots of questions raised, but the first thing that struck me was I had never heard of the Jagiellonian dynasty, although I've been reading around in this period for years. I was shocked, and then I got very curious. And I started reading and studying first at the Library of Congress, which is near my home, and then I got more adventurous. I traveled back to the sites, and finally I got in touch with various experts, biographers, curators, and then it just grew from there. One of the things that interested me when I went into the subject matter was discovered that I wasn't the only American who had never heard of the Jagiellonian dynasty. As a matter of fact, very few had. I began to realize that here is a story that needed to be told. And I began to think about writing a book. And as I thought about how to focus this book, the story of Zygmunt August, fortunately we can call him Augustus because that's what the family called him, and Baba Radziwiłł obviously stood out as the story that would be the focus to introduce people to this whole dynasty.
But your book is more than just retelling an old tale for an American audience. It is a new interpretation.
Anybody who has touched the story, the love story of Baba Radziwill and Augustus, is going to do a new interpretation. There are the facts. You know, they met, they formed a relationship where she was his mistress, they had a secret wedding, he had to go before the parliament and defend it, etc. But those facts had to be summed up. And the first person to sum it up, and let me see if I can find that paper, the first person to sum it up, of course, was Bona Sforza. And she summed up the story this way. This is the first interpretation of the facts. A debauched widow, deployed by a power-hungry political faction, seduces the immature and lecherous heir to the throne and dupes him into marriage, only to be challenged by a mother, Bona, determined to preserve the sanctity of her family. So there is the first version of the story, and it's a version that I wanted to investigate. I figured character into action. She is typifying these characters by their action. Let's go back and do the research and see what these characters were really like, either by finding the facts or by inference from their environment. And if you'll allow me now, I'd like to go through some of the data that I found about these three characters and see what then we would be working with when we decide to describe the action. Before I talk about Augustus, I'd like to play a reading. We're going to have John Pfeffer, who's going to read for us a passage from the book as I have written it, that gives you a sense of who Augustus was.
Ah, there is our hero now, Augustus said. Your Highness surely mistakes me for someone else. I have been called maestro, but never hero, he said as he bowed. A great prince and a master builder are alike in their heroism, Augustus replied. They both imagine something grand that does not yet exist, and holding stubbornly to that image, they muster the manpower and, stone by stone, they bring it into existence. I am at your service, Your Highness. Come then, the prince said, leading us with rapid steps to what might have been the hypotenuse of a triangle made up of the south and east wings of the palace. I have summoned you to Vilnius expressly to impress such an image on your fertile mind. Your Highness? The expectant Cini prompted. Imagine that you are standing at the center of a grand courtyard, paved with marble, and surrounded on all four sides by the palace of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania. Cini's eyes widened. He turned to look at the scattered buildings to the west and north, where Augustus was pointing. We would have to tear down those service buildings, including the kitchen. It would not be a matter of renovation this time. We would have to build from scratch in the new antique style. Yes, Maestro. Exactly, the prince said. I see a two-story building twice as long as it is wide, with its facade pierced by great square windows framed in stone, perhaps 4 balanced against 4 on either side of the portal. Cini picked up his enthusiasm. And through that portal, a flight of stairs in the Florentine style, rising broad and straight up to a grand reception room, marble, with gold fittings. The visiting ambassadors will think they have come into Jove's presence. Draw me the plans, Maestro. Cini was beaming. He had obviously been inspired by his patron's vision. Your Highness, he said, bowing once more. Great princes always build. So hungry builders have always claimed, Augustus responded. But so too did Castiglione and other wise men. But, Your Highness, we cannot pave the courtyard with marble. Marble inlaid with green gems, tourmaline, agate, malachite, jade, an everlasting lawn that will never fade or grow brown. But the horses' hooves, your highness, the wheels of the coaches. Simeon, I have no doubt you will bring reality to bear on my vision. Draw me the plans, and we will negotiate.
I think there you see a young heir to a throne who was concerned about the duties of a king. He even refers to the courtier by Castiglione, who talks about king's build. It's important. He's worrying about his duties, but he's acting like a king. He's imagining a new building in the Renaissance style, what they call the new antique style, new to them, but antique on its basis. And he is planning this building that he's going to build. He is dealing with a servant that he's brought in to do a service for him, but with humor, with jest. He is pointing out that this man has self-interest. It's very typical of Augustus throughout his life. He knows the self-interest. He says, the architect says, kings build, and he says, yeah, carpenters and builders always say so, but then he passes that by. He accepts that, and he goes on. And at the end, he's very reasonable. He's very reasonable. This was a young man who was educated by his mother, who had come from Italy in the best Renaissance tradition. He learned his classics. He was deeply into Cicero. He memorized passages of Virgil. He learned to dance, to joust. He learned to be a well-rounded prince and preparation for being a good ruler. He also was educated in his sex life. His mother sent Diana di Cordona, who was one of her ladies-in-waitings, to teach him about sex when he was in his teens. And there was that side of him. He was very much interested in women and pursued them, except during the 7 years that he was linked to Barbara. He had a brilliant mind. There's no doubt about it. He was a brilliant politician, as it turns out. That has been forgotten for a long time, but there are new biographies coming out. One by Anna Socheni Grabowska, which is particularly good in pointing out the brilliant strategic moves this man made as king. So he's being rethought, and we're coming up with a new view of him. But I have to admit, there was another side. And this is a side that you see everywhere when you read about him. Almost everybody who knew him commented on his melancholia. Today, we would describe it as depression. And it expressed itself in disgust. What do I mean by that? He was repelled and revolted by signs of disease, by signs of decay, by wounds, by any indication of decaying humanity, and he was deeply repelled by that. His first wife was a very lovely young girl, Elizabeth Habsburg, and she turned out to be surprised after the marriage, an epileptic, and he couldn't go near her after that. Here is the voice of Augustus when he is in one of his depressions.
The prince rose from the window seat as I entered, leered at me, and extended his silver wine cup in greeting, or a toast. He was still in his traveling clothes, disheveled, covered in dust. "I cannot stand having people near me tonight," he announced. I wondered if that meant I should withdraw, but he moved on, not incoherently, to his preference for all those ancient Roman statues dug up. Dig, 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 in Italy. At this point he seemed invigorated by the wine he kept sipping. He moved abruptly within the confines of his little stage, gesticulating erratically as he described a man of marble in combat with an enormous serpent, but still making sense if you followed his mental leaps. In the early stages of inebriation, he was fluent as ever, but he spit out his words more rapidly and digressed more frequently. I tried to make him comfortable. With Yezi's help, I lured him down from his little stage, bathed his face and hands, and maneuvered him into a clean shirt. While we did the grooming, he went on expatiating on the stupidity of physicians, the dissecting of cadavers, the rediscovery of ancient texts, and other things. Finally, he came back to those ancient sculptures. He said the ancient Greeks made their statues to measure athletes, nymphs, Apollo, Aphrodite. The proportions were predetermined. The Romans copied the Greek statues, and today the artists in Italy, even in Nuremberg, copied the Romans, always trying to recapture those perfect proportions. Nobody was arguing with him, but he kept insisting on their attempt to achieve perfect form. Finally, I said, "Yes, Your Highness, like the little bronze statues you have in your rooms at Grodno." "But Angelo," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "never forget, the bronze is not flesh, and flesh is never perfect. Those straight statues are a measure of our crookedness. They don't grow tired or bent. They don't limp or lose a leg in battle. They don't shrivel up and crumble with age. They don't excrete sweat, urine, and dung, and stink at every aperture. They don't fall over and die with egg-sized swellings in their groin or armpit. Flesh oozing, slimy, reeking." His face was twisted in a mask of agony as he reached the end of his peroration. I wanted to comfort him. "Your Highness," I cried, "God made us in his own image and set us where he wanted us to be, a little higher than the beasts and lower than the angels, with enough sense to strive upward toward perfection." He guffawed. "I suppose you also believe a saint's ankle bone can do miracles. Where do you see people striving for perfection? Not in Grodno, not in Krakow, certainly not in the Vatican. If you push aside the veil of comforting words and look at people with the naked eye, you'll see they are as bent as a bishop's crook." On and on he went, constantly digressing, but always, it seemed to me, amplifying the same theme. He also went on drinking, too, until the wine, rather than anything I could say, seemed to calm him down. He began slurring his words and losing his thought more often. Finally, he grew incoherent, fell to muttering, and then to sleep. He lay face down on the large bed in the center of the room. I had known that he frequently caroused with his chosen companions, talking nonsense, laughing at foolishness, even jostling the nearest fellow, but this was different, more like suffering from an illness, an imbalance of the humors, and taking wine to alleviate the melancholia and lull awareness to sleep. I was determined to shield him, when he was like that, from the spying eyes of his enemies, and from his supporters as well.
So there is Augustus in his bad moods. Let me just say now, his relationship with Barbara would not have lasted for the 7 years till death did them part if she weren't really good at bolstering and supporting a depressed individual and helping him get over his bad periods and get on with his function in his life. Barbara was a court beauty. Barbara was a celebrity of the day and age. When she arrived at court, everybody lined up on either sides of the path to watch her come in. She knew she was a celebrity and a court beauty. She set the style. She wore cochineal red, this deep shade of red which I've described as red washed with sunshine or red washed with gold. Very expensive. The cochineal dye came from Latin America. It came through Spain. It had just discovered and was settling Latin America. And it was her color. She even painted the wheels of her coach that color. She was indeed beautiful, although the portraits we have of her don't show it, and that's because they are copies. We no longer have any of the originals. We have prints based on the originals, but not the real things. But we do have the word of the papal legate, who said, in regard to beauty, She has no comparison in Christendom. And that's a very strong statement for a priest who didn't like her to make. At the same time, besides being a courtier and a court beauty, she was a country girl. Think about her life. She was raised in a family that, yes, went to court to deal with government and have power, but their wealth and their life was based on their estates. She grew up in Dubinki, an island estate that is in the middle of a beautiful lake. When she married at 14, she went to Jagiellonian, and she lived probably for the next few years at home because on the estate, because she didn't have a child. And before the wife had the first child and heir, it is likely that she was kept pretty much at home, maybe taken to a court to be shown off occasionally, but most life. All throughout her life, she loved the woods. When she was with Augustus, they often retreated to Rudniki, which was their hunting lodge in a very beautiful woods. When she came to Krakow as queen, she loved to go to Niepołomice, which for our American audience, we use her name that she called it, which was Niebo, meaning easier to pronounce, meaning heaven. So the woods was very important to her. But let's add another thing about that woods. Christianity only came to Lithuania, where she grew up, in 1387. It had only been around for 136 years when she was born. The people who tended her when she was growing up, her nurses and the people who surrounded her, had grandmothers who were pagans. There were still demons in the woods when she was growing up, and there is evidence of her interest in that. So here is a woman who could be a court beauty and could also be a country girl and live and have a special attachment to nature. By the way, this reflects an old Renaissance topos, that is the preference for the court opposed to country, or the preference for the country opposed to court. It's endlessly debated in Renaissance literature, and it's here in this book as well. She wrote 2 letters that interested me very much. In the first one, she drops into a letter to her brother, and it's addressed to her mother, and she says to her mother, "Could you send me the makeup of that color I prefer? I can't get it here in Krakow." End of note. Obviously, her appearance and her performance as queen was very important to her. The other letter was written when she was very young, and it's also 1 line long. She says to her father, "Do not abandon me." It was written when she was 14 and about to go into arranged marriage that lasted until she was 20. Clearly, she was traumatized by being put into a foreign and it turned a hostile household where only her mother-in-law was maybe on her side. And that trauma remains with her through her life. Do not abandon me. And the word abandonment becomes very important as she goes on. So here, let's hear the lucidity of Barbara as she talks to Augustus early on in her relationship. They met cute. He goes to her deceased husband's estate where she's living with her mother-in-law, who's also a widow. She's visiting. She's not living there. He is coming to claim the total property of this family because there was no heir. So they should have been hostile, but they weren't. The family was ready to obey the law and give up their property, the 2 women. And she is the hostess because her mother-in-law is really ill and failing, and she takes him around, and she's very sedate. She's very standoffish. She's keeping herself withdrawn, except every now and then when they see something that excites her, like the Arabian colt, or like the pears that she says are the sweetest pears in all of Lithuania. She gets excited about the country things. When the prince responds and tries to elicit more from her, she freezes up. And so he decides to ask her why. Why? And here's John reading that passage.
"Why do you act like that?" Augustus asked Lady Barbara. She sat down again. "Act like what? Why do you speak with such passion about the wonders of the world you inhabit, and when I respond, assume the demeanor of a bishop's housekeeper whose nipple I've just pinched?" "Whose nipple you've just pinched?" She was laughing, but still she buried her face in her hands. I suspected she needed a moment to determine how to respond, and when she did, it was no pinched housekeeper who spoke. She turned in her chair and looked directly at him. "I will not have my life directed by the expectations of the gossips at court, or the villains in the streets of Vilnius." "Expectations? You know what they say about you. You are their ideal man. You are, by virtue of your beauty and vigor, your natural wit and education, your prowess on the jousting field, the lord of all lords, and the desire of all ladies, and no woman could or should resist you." "They are talking about a creature I am supposed to impersonate, not about me," he said, with an unnecessary candor. "They talk about me too. I know what they say. I am the most beautiful woman at court, tra-la-la. I charm every room I enter and excite the desire of every man I meet. Oh, I admit I have sometimes enjoyed playing that part, the beautiful silks and taffetas, the jewels, the dancing, witty talk, and the admiration." Her voice fell off. I see. So they think, or so you think, that our meeting is inevitable and can only end in one thing," Augustus said. "Only one thing. I seduce you, while you ravish me, and together we go up in the hissing blue flames of passion," she said. I was shocked at her frankness, while Augustus broke into laughter. "Their expectations are not destiny," she insisted. "I intend to resist. I intend to play it out as this immediate situation requires, as hostess for the faltering house of Gashtold, yielding up our wealth to the representative of the ascendant house of Jagiellonian, just as my ailing mother-in-law has instructed me to do." "But why this resistance? Why would you not choose to play out our larger role as the greater world expects us to do?" From where I stood, only a sliver of his face was visible, and I could not tell if he were pleading, teasing, or merely curious. No matter, her answer, which came swiftly, had no relation to the tone of his question. "Because the great world which demands it would condemn us for it. They would characterize our encounter as careless and self-indulgent on your part, and calculated and cunning on mine." She paused for a second and shook her head. "But that's not it. I have played the part of the court beauty for some time now, and the men who have pursued me bring no joy." "But there are those moments of intense pleasure, transient as they are," he began. "Others have had all the pleasure. I have felt nothing, except on occasion, the desire to bathe," she said. I thought she had carried candor too far. He would tell her so. But before he could respond at all, she pressed things further. "And you?" she asked the prince. "Have you found joy in posing as the most lusty lover in the land?" To my amazement, he picked up her terms. "I have taken my pleasure and found relief, but no joy at all. None," he said evenly. "Well then," she said, rising from her chair, "we both have reason to resist expectation."
Okay, now we come to the third party that we need to look at as we try to examine what really happened back there then, and that's Bona Sforza. Remember, she was born in Borgia, Italy. Through all her life, they said she must be poisoning people because she's an Italian from Borgia, Italy. She is really the heir to the Duchy of Milan, although she never got her hands on it. Her father, Giano Galeazzo Sforza, was young when his father died, and his uncle Lodovico was his regent, and somehow John Galeazzo never grew up and never became duke. He was allowed to marry. He did have 3 children, one of whom was Bona, but somehow he was not mature enough to rule, and he died in a mysterious way. And Bona's mother and her children fled and eventually ended up living in the Duchy of Bari in southern Italy. The other 2 children died, and she was left, Bona was left alone with her mother in what must have been a miserable childhood. She was born late in all these events, but she must have heard about it day by day. She was rescued from this situation by a marriage to Sigismund I, and who was at that time 51 years old. She was 27 years younger, an arranged marriage. 9 months to the day she married, she gave birth to her first daughter. Should have been a son, but it was a daughter. Shortly afterwards, she had Augustus. From that time on, she wore dresses with pomegranates on them because pomegranates signified fertility. She was proud of her accomplishment. She had done what a wife was supposed to do in an arranged marriage. But she went on, and she got much more interested in politics. And she looked around her and she said, my husband is old. When he dies, I'm probably going to be left regent with this son, Augustus. So she did something which is legal but is very rare. She had him crowned Grand Duke of Lithuania when he was 7 years old and his father was still alive, and King of Poland when he was 9 years old and his father was still alive, in preparation for being regent. Only Sigismund I didn't die. He went on for two more decades. During that time, she became politically active. She formed a coterie around her. She became an important party at court, often in contention with the other parties at court. And as the king failed, she picked up the reins of government, slowly but surely. They did not pass to her son. She was getting more and more power. And this is where the story begins. I want to say this about Bona. You know, you could write this book from her perspective and it would be a different book.
This sounds very much like a generational conflict. Like the younger generation is trying to establish itself and meets the strong opposition from the elders.
I think that's exactly what's going on, and of course that makes a good plot for a novel, but it was a favorite plot, I think, in the Renaissance. Sigismund I ruled for 41 years, and he wasn't very young when he became king. During that period, a lot of things changed. The economy changed, the grain trade took off. There was a change. More and more ideas came in from Italy because Bona brought Italian thinkers and Italian builders and Italian artisans into the country. The first generation, the older generation, were really into humanism, the notion that man is pretty good. This is an ideal. We can reach high heights through man. And the next generation had a lot of doubts about that. That's basically what you hear Augustus talking about in that mad scene we read. That, you know, humanity doesn't stand up to the image that we have been given of him. This is very disappointing. So we're in the waning of the Renaissance, when the original ideas are falling down. There was so much difference that occurred during these 41 years that the younger generation were even wearing different clothing from the older generation. The older generation is wearing a contush, and the younger generation are wearing the Italian doublet and jerkin and hose. So in the Renaissance, there's this new emphasis on the individual. There's a new emphasis, therefore, on the individual versus the family. And this is, of course, generational conflict. But it's interesting that in most instances, the conflict was based on arranged marriages. The attempt of the parents to arrange a marriage that was for the benefit of the family rather than in the interest necessarily of the children, and the resistance of the children to this. So that is the form the generational conflict took.
So actually, it's the threat of the arranged marriages that prompts that secret marriage. So crucial to any version of the story.
Yeah, it is. The threat of the arranged marriage, this is working the other way around. Let me give you a little bit what happens in the middle, because it really is a delightful part of the book. At least I delighted writing it. In order to move closer to his goal of taking his place as king, Augustus arranges with his father to be Grand Duke of Lithuania under his father's supreme dukeship. He arranges this by promising to live with his wife Elizabeth and to bear children. And it seems like a good arrangement. They go to Vilnius, and Elizabeth dies. At that point, Barbara becomes the Grand Duke's mistress. Barbara becomes Augustus's mistress. Now, she agrees to become his mistress because, as she says in a very amusing conversation, a mistress can say no, a wife can't, which was the case in those days. It's an arrangement that she feels comfortable with. And it turns out to be an excellent partnership. Together they build a court in Vilnius, which is the center of culture. They build a library. They buy all these books. They really charge up the musical culture of the court. They get very interested, or Augustus was very interested, in the works of the goldsmith. He's actually a collector. He's not collecting just gems, but he's collecting works that the goldsmith makes. Think of Cellini, beautiful objects made of gold and beautiful jewels. They actually built a zoo on an adjacent island so that people could see the animals. There weren't pictures in those days. There weren't photographs. There weren't movies. So they could see and learn about the animals of the world. So this was a very productive period. But toward the end of it, people started pressuring him. He had to marry and beget an heir. And although he resisted, Bona finally settled on Anna Sophia, the daughter of the Duke of Prussia, Anna Sophia of Prussia. And she sends her a litter of Spanish puppies to show how much she likes her. And there's a lot of jokes about the Spanish puppies. But this is a serious threat. It looks as if Augustus may be pressured into marriage. This gets the Radziwiłł clan very upset. What's going to happen to Barbara? We haven't talked about the two Nicholases. Black Nicholas, who was the head of the family, Red Nicholas, who was called Rudy, who is the brother of Barbara. And they get together and they decide, let's trap this king into marrying Barbara. He loves her. He's not going to give her up easily. So they give him an ultimatum. Look, what's her future going to be? If you marry, and what's her future going to be? So either you marry her or step back, remove yourself, stay away from her, and allow us to arrange a marriage for her so she'll be fine after you've gone off to Krakow. And he thinks about it for a while, and he thinks about her fate, and he decides he will step back, and the two separated from each other. Only the Radziwiłls don't remove her from town. She's still in the same bedroom that he used to visit every night, just 2 gardens away from his palace. She's miserable. She sends him word, they're trying to trap you. Stay away. He knows that there is a trap, and he sits there and thinks. And after a while, he comes to a conclusion that this marriage is right. He should marry her. And he decides to walk into the trap, eyes wide open, and marry Barbara. And that is what is part of the reading that John's going to give you now.
She had already lifted her head and seen him. "Augustus, go away. You must not come here," she said as she threw back the white coverlet. and swinging bare feet onto the floor, rushed toward him. She embraced him, locking her arms around him, repeating over and over again, "Go away! You should not be here!" As if to make up for all the nights of separation, he held on to her as she held him, and kissed her forehead, her cheek, her neck. Finally, she began to pull herself back and push him away. "This is a trap. I am their bait. They are waiting for you with a priest to marry us." Then, in fact, they were in the room, entering not through the antechamber where Yeji and I stood looking on, but through the servants' entrance on the corner. They crowded in, first Rudy, then Black Nicholas, and finally the nephew Stanisław. Had they been drinking while they waited? Certainly Rudy had a beaker in his hand. Nicholas spoke first. "Your Highness, you promised us not to visit our cousin and sister, but to leave her free to contract an honorable marriage." Augustus knew the three men who stood there, but still he stood facing Lady Barbara, holding on to her shoulders as she pushed him away with both hands. "And how do you know," he said, "that this visit of mine will not bring an honorable marriage as well as fame and wealth to your family?" "God grant it," Nicholas said piously. Barbara sprang free and turned to face Nicholas. "God forbid it," she shouted. "I forbid it. It would ruin him." All the loathing in Nicholas's soul was in his voice when he snapped back at her. "You foolish, spoiled ingrate! Think of the honor bestowed on your family. He is ready to make you Queen of Poland." Augustus interrupted him. "Nicholas, go fetch the priest whom they tell me you have in hiding. Let me speak to Barbara, and then give her a few moments to dress herself. Return in a quarter of an hour, and then witness the fulfilling of my promise." They filed out, Nicholas looking angry and determined, Rudy beaming with joy, and young Stanisław perhaps bewildered and embarrassed. Lady Barbara watched them go and turned toward Augustus. "They think they have trapped a king," she said bitterly. "You are too honorable. Do not let them presume upon your regard for them in order to trick you into doing something you will regret for years to come." He was quite calm now and determined, and he spoke to her in a soothing, low voice. "Why should I refrain from doing what I want to do, just because someone is trying to lure me into doing it?" he asked. "I have never wanted to be the wife of a Grand Duke, certainly not a king," she said, speaking more slowly, almost in a whisper. "If I do not marry you, I will have to marry a woman I do not love and will grow to hate. If you refuse to marry me, they will marry you off to another Gastald," he said, speaking more firmly. "I could enter a convent," she said. He laughed at that gently, and then she laughed too. "If I go to Krakow and you stay here, the happiness we have had for the past 3 years is forever lost. If we marry, we will be able to preserve at least some piece of it." She looked at him, into his lean, dark face for a few moments longer, shook her head, and made that noise women make when they are totally frustrated. Then she turned away and called her maid. When I asked her later at Dubinki why she consented, she said simply, "I was very confused that night. I had thought he was going to abandon me. I thought he should." She paused a moment and frowned. "No, that's not it. It was because of the absence. We married after weeks and weeks of self-imposed absence. I could not bear it anymore. The grief it causes and the panic, it was too much."
Augustus is certainly a complex character because his main objective is to get the throne. And right before it comes to fruition, he puts this huge obstacle right on his path.
He gave Bona a stick to beat him with, and she really did beat him. So, She organized a smear campaign. There were many smear campaigns like this in the Renaissance, but this was one of the most vicious. She first did it verbally. At the Parliament, when the idea was proposed that Augustus act as regent and take care of his father who was failing, she told the story of his being duped into marriage by the Radziwiłłs, and that killed the idea. She went home and she started writing letters to the nobility. She was writing them in the name of her husband, who really wasn't capable of writing letters anymore, saying that this disgraceful thing had happened, this disgraceful marriage, and they should turn their backs on it. She later, when her husband died, she wrote a letter saying that he died from shame of what her son had done. Well, the aristocracy across the country was receiving these letters, and they talked about it, and the priests gave sermons against it. Actually, treatises were written against it. Actually, orations were made against it. And this was the age of the printing press. There were actually 16 different printing houses in Krakow during the 16th century. All of these things got printed and spread. And in addition, broadsheets, as they call them, little pamphlets, which are really nastier, were also being distributed across the country. By the time Sigismund Augustus I died, the nation had been turned against the heir apparent by a very violent smear campaign. Let me read you just one quatrain, written no less by Nicholas Ray, about Barbara Radziwiłł. It goes, "To crown with gold a putrid bawd, who cannot even a fetus make because the devil sealed her womb, defies and defiles the law of God." That's heavy stuff to be laid on Barbara Radziwiłł. What happens, of course, is that Augustus comes to Krakow. He sits quietly through the funeral of his father, which was a 3-day event. Weddings and funerals are big publicity events for dynasties. And as soon as it is over, there is a confrontation with his mother, part of which John is going to read to you now.
When the deputies arrive in Piotrków, she continued, they will be bound by oath to condemn your marriage and demand you repudiate that woman. And if you think the Senate or any of the magnates will defend you, you are deceived. Whatever they say to your face, they will take the side of the deputies rather than see you raise the disreputable daughter of a rival family higher than they. At the word disreputable, Augustus finally leaned forward in his chair and interrupted her. You paint a dire picture of my situation. What is your point? Not a picture. I am holding up a mirror to your face. Your self-indulgence and gullibility have created a situation that you cannot escape except through humiliating submission to your parliament or by renouncing your throne. Either way, the damage you will do to the kings that came before you and those that follow will be irreparable. You are trapped. You need the assistance of people older and more experienced in governing to set you loose. And where will I find the kind of wise and experienced counselor of whom you speak? Augustus asked. Perhaps because she had stopped listening to her children so many years before, she missed the irony in his voice. Peter Kmita and I could turn this situation around. I could call on others who are beholden to me to rally around you. But my son, there are conditions. Now that you see how dire the situation is, you must agree to an annulment and to betrothal to Anna Sophia of Prussia. Nicholas Radziwill, who played you for a fool and duped you into this marriage, must be executed or at least exiled. Once you agree to these steps, I will send Peter Kmita to you, and working through him, I will clear the way for you to begin your reign with honor and dignity. How nicely you build our future. It is like a stack of bricks. I repudiate my wife. I betroth myself to the Prussian girl. I accept your man Kmita as my chief minister. And you, Well, the rebellious hearts of the deputies and senators. Of course, the whole stack rests on one heavy, broad brick at the base. Your beloved only son's recognition of his childlike inability to govern his emotions, and therefore his subjects. If we pull out that brick, your whole stack tumbles to the ground. He rose, and of course she rose too, forgetting her weariness and her irritation at his resistance. "Be careful what words you choose, my son," she said in a threatening tone. "So much depends on what you say to me now." He seemed not to hear her warning. "Madonna," he went on in Italian, "not only do I refuse to renounce my wife, but I intend to bring her within a matter of weeks to Krakow." Bona interrupted. "You cannot bring that woman to Wawel. Your sisters would rather retire to a monastery or hospice than live in the same palace with her. I will not receive her at court. I will not sleep under the same roof." "That may be as well," Augustus said. "The Queen's house will be needed to house the Queen." "You would not dare," she hissed. "The whole nation would convulse with repulsion." "Madonna, I insist that you retire. Retire and think about your situation. Your husband's seals have been broken, and the authority you derived from his position is gone. He provided for this juncture in your life by giving you the income from the entire province of Mazovia. He was generous, and I am glad for you. I demand that you stop intruding in matters of state and direct yourself to managing the fields, forests, and all those villages that have been given to you in dower. That is my wish." With that, he walked to the east window of our tower chamber and stood as if gazing out at the roofs and river beyond. She was left staring at his back. "You foolish child! You will undo all the work of my lifetime. You will bring down the house of Jagiellonian," she said, starting toward the door. "I will pray on my knees to the Mother of God that before you come to ruin and desolation, you turn to me for assistance. A mother's heart is forgiving." The steel in her voice belied all talk of forgiveness. She passed between her two ladies and through the door, which Yeji, who must have been listening outside, opened in remarkably timely fashion. The two ladies turned and followed her out.
After he sent Bona off to Warsaw, where she continued to conspire against him, he has to go alone to Parliament. And he has to face this total Parliament, which is committed to making him repudiate his wife. And they come up with all kinds of fantastic ideas. If he divorces her, which is a sin against the church, they were going to divide the sin amongst all the males in Poland and Lithuania, so it would be dispersed and it wouldn't matter. That's heresy. There were all kinds of other ideas and arguments that they made, and he had a strategy. Augustus had a strategy. Every day as he went down the stairs to sit in Parliament and sit on the throne, surrounded by all of these people, and listen to them give speech after speech after speech, telling him off, he would say, "If I break my vows to my wife, how could you believe the vows I make to you?" In other words, he ignored all of their extravagant arguments, he ignored what they were saying, and he took the high ground. You're asking me to break a vow, and I can't break a vow. After almost a month of all of this, they again gave a big speech in the Parliament, insisting that he repudiate his wife. And at the end of it, instead of threatening him, they got down on their knees and they begged him. And he looked at them and he pointed a finger at them and he said, "What kind of behavior is this for the knighthood of Poland?" And then he said, "If I break my vows to my wife, how could you believe the vows I make to you?" And they just were worn out. He won. Eventually, shortly after that, the Parliament broke up. He went to claim Barbara, who was in Novi Korczyn, and together they entered Krakow as king and queen, but queen without a crown. They refused in Parliament to give him the right to crown her. He had to fight for that for the next 2 years.
So Barbara and Augustus should be celebrating a provisional triumph. They enter Krakow together, and the woman who did not want to be the queen moves into the queen's house.
Indeed, she does. And there was some happiness there while she was in Krakow, but there was a lot of opposition that remained. The happiness, we went looking for it when we went to have a special tour through Wawel, the beautiful palace that they were living in, and I found it hidden in a corner. Typically, Augustus, he refused to live in the king's apartment, but he lived in the apartment he had as a young man on the second floor of the palace. Barbara was at the other end in the west wing on the third floor of the palace in what was called the queen's house, because he was going to establish the fact that she was queen. We went and looked at the west end of the second floor, and lo and behold, we found this long cylindrical structure against the wall. This was the spiral staircase, now closed up and covered over, which took you from the second floor up to the third floor and into the ladies' chamber. They lived a life of formality, he acting as king, she acting as queen, for instance, going to Mass each day together in the morning, doing the other rites and rituals that the king and queen do, but they had their own private, intimate life that was carried on through the back staircase. She calls this duplicity, and that makes the narrator of this book a little bit upset because he doesn't like the word duplicity, and she explains. On the meadow, she said, finally, he greeted me with great courtesy, spoke about welcoming a queen to her realm, and then we listened while his spokesman and my spokesman exchanged remarks in Latin. When he led me to this apartment, he shoved me a little behind the door and kissed me the way he used to do in Vilnius, and he said, "Thank God you're here. There'll be no more absences between us, no more." So they had this happiness, they had this life, they had a lot to celebrate. On the other hand, the court remained hostile. She was the woman who had bewitched the king. The king spent too much time with her. She was from Lithuania. She wasn't as sophisticated as they. And there's a lot of evidence in the letters that she had a lot to contend with. Her cousin Nicholas, of course, keeps writing letters and says over and over again, she acts like a farm girl. She doesn't know how to behave. Doesn't she understand she is queen? But of course, we know what he's saying. He's saying she should be acting as an agent for the Radziwill family. Instead, she's in love with her husband. She's not acting the way queens have always acted in the past. So those letters shouldn't be taken too seriously. But there is one letter that I felt that I wanted to understand a little better, because it is written by a secretary who was very loyal to her and loyal to her brother Rudy. And he writes to Rudy and says, things are not going well here for Barbara. She's doing things that alienates people. And when you look through the letter to see what his specific examples are, there are two. She occasionally goes into her rooms and she locks the doors and she keeps out all the courtiers, even her steward. He knocks on the door and she won't let him in. That's one of the objections he raises. The other one is, the other day, the king came with all of his ministers to call on her so they could go together into the cathedral. She locked the door, she stayed in, evidently primping and getting ready to go out, and she made them wait for an hour and a half. Well, if she's doing these things, she's acting very irresponsibly. She's being just a vain woman who's more interested in her appearance than she is or whatever else. All of that is true unless she is ill and trying to hide it. And of course, that is what was happening. She began having these occasional illnesses. This is how she described them. It's the same time each time it occurs. There is a fever, and I lose my appetite. The pains are so severe that I cannot sleep. Finally a stone appears, hard, hot, dry, trying to break the skin. Sometimes it weeps this vile substance before it disappears. The stench is terrible. This last time the pain was excruciating, and a second stone followed the first. The letters always refer to what must be an abscess as a stone. It's created some mystery, but we think that abscess, because it says it festers, that this is an abscess. So that explains it. What happens in the book is that the narrator and his wife, who is her cousin, go to visit her while she is staying in a monastery while Augustus is at his second parliament. And she's staying nearby so he can visit her. They're not going to have any more absences. And she tells them a little bit about this illness. And she tells them that she's hiding it. And they don't think this hiding is a good idea. The best physicians need to be summoned. And at the end of this chapter, the narrator takes her for a walk, something they always did together, and he presses her on the subject. And that's the scene that John is going to read for us now.
We passed into a copse, dark and still wet from the rain. There were an unusual number of fallen trees lying among the ferns. "I am surprised the monks have not cleared this wood," I commented idly. She was not listening. "Look at that," she said, stopping before one of the fallen trunks. It must have lain there rotting for some time, and a bright bloom of white tissue had spread over its brow. "It is so lovely, a white fleecy flower," she said. I laughed, relieved to see her so animated. "But it is only fungus battening on the rotting wood," I teased. "You sound just like Augustus. He would find it disgusting and look away." I remembered how she had used that word, disgusting, in talking about Augustus's melancholia, and suddenly all became clear. "That's the real reason you are keeping your illness a secret, isn't it? You are afraid Augustus will find it disgusting," I blurted out. She still stood facing me, and I saw the panic in her large eyes and the shifting of muscles on her face as she tried to maintain her composure. "But your fear is ridiculous. No Polish queen has ever been so loved." "Because he thinks I am beautiful, perfect, immaculate. Elizabeth Habsburg was lovely, wasn't she? He could not tolerate her once he knew about her disease. You were there. You saw how he reacted. You know how repulsive he found her because of her illness." Her panic overcame her composure, and she collapsed down onto the more solid end of the trunk and buried her face in her hands. I could barely make out the next muffled words. "If he knew I had these horrible festering sores on my body." "But he does know," I asserted. She looked up, her face white, wet, horrified. "What do you mean? How could he know?" "Petrus told him, in my presence, in December, after the birthday celebration," I explained. "Damn him to hell!" she cried. "All of you men gossiping about me, talking about my illness in front of Augustus." There was a clenching of fists in front of her face, and then her hands fell, and the panic was again totally exposed. "They will do anything they can to destroy his love for me." "It wasn't like that." She wasn't hearing me. "Your Grace," I said, hoping the formal address would gather up her attention. "It is now 6 months since Dr. Petrus described your sore to the king. Has it lessened his love for you?" "How could I know?" "How could you not know?" Her mind was obviously dwelling on the question I had posed, and perhaps because she feared the answer she might find, she began talking more volubly than she had all morning. "I tried so hard to keep him from finding out. Once he came to the Queen's house, accompanied by ministers and senators, so that we could proceed together into the cathedral. I had not yet finished dressing, still sitting in front of the mirror, sweating, my face gray, so weak and in such pain. I began painting, white wax and rouge, anything to make me look less ill, but my hands were shaking and I made a mess of it. Dorothy took up the ceruse and kept adding more until I looked like a crone, trying to cover her wrinkles and warts. We had to scrape it all off and start again, and then replace the sleeve that was stained. All the while, the King of Poland and his ministers were waiting in the antechamber, and the chapel was delaying the service in the cathedral. When I finally emerged, perhaps an hour or more after the appointed time, Augustus was leading the ministers in a discussion about the ambitions of the young Muscovite Tsar, and whether the English regents would sell him cannons. He greeted me as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. "So you kept the king and all those dignitaries waiting in your anteroom for over an hour, and Augustus made little of it," I said. "Yes," she said, "this illness has interrupted." "Well, what further evidence do you need that although he knows, he still adores you?"
Thank you, John. So illness has become a reality for this couple. It's only occasional so far. It goes away, and when it goes away, she's her old self. So there were still some good times. There was the matter of Bona's submission, which is a trick that Bona was playing, but more important, there was finally the coronation.
Yeah, when we think about the coronation, we think about this amazing pearl headdress she wore that day that became a historical icon, maybe with different associations depending how do we view that part of our history.
It's amazing how that visual image is common and well known in Poland. I would suspect if the story got known here, it would too. It was an extraordinary image. This is something else. This is every pearl she ever owned, and then some, sewed cheek by jowl, right beside each other. This is not a veil in which you have sprinkled a few pearls. This is solid pearl. It took weeks and weeks for the goldsmith who was in the ground floor working on her clothing to put together this headdress. Those black objects around her face are diamonds set in black settings to make them sparkle more. It's called the black fire. You know, this certainly is an extraordinary headdress designed to make people stop and look again. And if I can find it, there's a cute little passage that is whispered at the coronation by Petronella, her cousin, to the narrator. The narrator says, it must be the Russian necklace of Princess Sophia. And Petronella, the cousin who's in on the secret, says, that, and the 3 ropes of pearls the king gave her, and the 10 pearl collars from her trousseau, and the pearls from every ring, bracelet, and brooch she owns, Petra whispered. When people are blinded by falsehoods, it takes a fine excess to make them look again. This is deliberate. This is not just costume for the sake of costume. It's deliberate. But there is something strange about this headdress, and that's the cut of the cloth underneath it that the pearls are sewed onto. If you look at these 3 portraits, there is Barbara with the pearl headdress. There is Barbara in the next portrait wearing that unusual cloth of gold headdress that she's wearing. The 2 sort of look alike. When I tried to get some of the experts on costume, and there are a lot of them around, and I wrote to several, to identify the shape of the gold headdress, I got no good answer. Basically, they said, we don't know where that came from. We don't have other instances of that. Maybe it came from Persia, one person said. Elsewhere, I've seen it called Ruthenian, yet there are no photographs, prints you can find or pictures you can find of Ruthenian women wearing them back there then. Now look at Bona's widow's cap. The cut of that is remarkably similar. It goes around the head and around the neck, under the chin and around the neck. It's very similar to Barbara's headdress. And one can't help wondering if this, and think of what the widow's headdress is supposed to be. I mean, it is a statement that I'm finished with trying to look beautiful. I'm finished with all that. I'm in mourning for my husband who is dead. And there is some of that in the pearl headdress. There's some covering up of Barbara's face. If you look at the dress of gold that she's wearing, the portrait with her in the dress, in the gold threaded dress, she's covered up a lot. There's a lot hidden. The woman had, and it was still there when her body was exhumed in the 1930s, gorgeous blonde hair. So why is she covering it up? But you'll say, if it's a cover-up, why all the pearls? Well, look at these icons. Look at these images of the Madonna. Actually, we heard one mentioned before in the home of Princess Sophia, who was from an Orthodox background and might have had this kind of icon in a house where Barbara would have seen it regularly. The pearls on the Madonna are a statement of innocence, of purity. So one wonders about this crown. You know, the poster, very famous poster that Pogowski put out in 1983 to advertise a film about Barbara Radziwiłł, says the little bit of pearl necklace, pearl headdress that is showing under her chin, and the nude body, it says, hey, this is free, liberated sexuality. That's what Barbara meant in that generation. And they were really probably influenced by a book that came out in 1976 by Kukovic, who argued that what made Barbara special was her free, liberated attitude to sexuality. That's what turned Augustus on. That's what she means to us. And of course, Kukovic is really speaking to his more puritanical contemporaries than he is, I think, ultimately to what Barbara was. I think that basically when she put on this pearl helmet and walked before this pearl, and think of it as a helmet, it's a defense, and walks before the court, she's denying the allegations that have made against her. She is asserting her purity, and she's asserting her integrity. I'm afraid that she never lived long enough to overcome the big lie that Bona put out about her.
She died 5 months after the coronation, and the 19th century left us with a pretty sentimental picture of the death scene. The similar painting is very popular in Poland, very well known.
Yes, there is that painting by Simler, 1860. Let me tell you, it wasn't like that at all. She couldn't eat. She couldn't even eat the fermented hogweed soup that they brought her. She wasted away. As her heart started failing, her legs swelled up. She constantly had a fever. She was constantly calling for water. Gradually, her organs became infected and failed. It was a very sad picture. It's the way people actually die, not the way they die in 19th century paintings. The ugliness of the scene allows us at least to tie up the love theme. Augustus did not abandon her. What happened was extraordinary. He abandoned his duties as king. He turned them over to his ministers. He went up the back stairs and he nursed her himself. He banned the courtiers who were not sympathetic, and he banned the courtiers from her chambers. And with the help of our narrator and his wife, who was Petronella, who was the queen's cousin, he cared for her for many months. And he was with her when she died. Just before she died, there is this little episode that John's going to read for us.
The next day, the stone began to fester. The doctor from Poznan was exultant. "Creamy flowing pus means healing," he repeated for the 100th time. That was the day I glanced through the door that Petra had left open and saw a thing I bring to mind whenever I am forced to think about that miserable time. It is as if one of the court painters had caught the scene in luminous colors, gold, purple, white, and black, and I can gaze at it in amazement and fend off the brutal memories forcing their way into my consciousness. Augustus is bending over the bed, over his wife's belly, and with his bare hands lifts the bandage off the suppurating stone and drops it into the copper pot at his feet. With a cloth dipped in wine, he gingerly cleans the lesion, and this is the image captured in my painting, my icon. He kneels and kisses not the wound, but the soft skin beside it. I could not see his expression as he performed this ritual. His face was in profile to me, the same profile engraved on the coins of the realm, but it had to be expressing the opposite, the very antidote to repulsion. And from what I saw in the sick room before I closed the door, that antidote had to be whatever ripens in the mind when deep, passionate love reaches maturity.
There are many theories about the cause of death of Barbara. Do you have yours?
Yes, I guess everyone does. It's a mystery how she died. Of course, her enemies immediately said it was syphilis. When they examined her body in the 30s, they ruled that out. It wasn't syphilis. That was simply the accusation he made against anyone you didn't like in the 16th century. Others said then, and it's been repeated, that she died of cancer of the birth canal, either cervical or, I think more likely, if you're going to go that route, endometriosis. And to that, I would just add that historians like women who have exceeded the sexual norms of their generation to die of diseases that are appropriate. It sometimes happens, not all historians, but that sometimes happens. I'm not sure that she had cancer at all. The other idea that's been suggested is she died of sepsis. And to me, after consultation with people at the American National Medical Library, I think sepsis may be the real cause of her death. It was a cause, for instance, of Henry VIII's death. His was from a wound he got in jousting. Hers could have been from the lancing of a boil. It can start any way whatsoever. And I put that in the mouth of Reb Solomon Ashkenazi, the one Jewish doctor who tended upon her. And then, of course, there's the last suggestion, that she died of poison. And if you think of the structure of a piece of fiction, it should end where it starts and starts where it ends. You might see why you have to read to the very last 3 pages of this book to see the accusation made, the 3 plots tied up, and see where poison fits in.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It was very interesting. I'm so glad we could connect this way. In what stage is your book now?
The book is done. It was 5 or 6 years of hard work, but it was a joy. The state it's in now is not a joy. In order to get it into the hands of a leading and responsible publishing house, you have to get a literary agent. So I am sending letters and samples to literary agents, and one of them has to pick it out, sponsor it, and present it to an editor. The trouble is, as I was learned from about one agent whom I would have liked very much, he receives 4,000 such submissions every year. His staff picks out 4, and he reads them, and then he sponsors 1. So the numbers, the odds are against you. What will happen? Eventually, an accident will happen. Somebody who is interested in some aspect of this book will say, oh my goodness, here it is. Pull it out, read it, and if it has the merit that I think it has, agree to sponsor it and send it to a publisher. Alternatively, a third party might get involved. A party who is interested in the Polish subject matter, a party who's interested in a historical novel, a party who's just interested in this love story that should be told. And that person who has connections will give his or her name or make the connection, and the book will come out of the slush pile. It'll happen, but it takes time.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. I certainly hope it will be published soon. And please keep us informed. We're going to Let know our members when the book will be available in print.